What would you do if a flight attendant slapped you in front of a full plane of passengers? You'd be stunned, right? Well, that's exactly what happened to one woman. And just 3 minutes later, the flight attendant was kicked off the plane. But what led to that shocking moment? And how did everything spiral out of control so quickly? Stick around because this story is about to get crazier than you can imagine. Before we start the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any new videos. It started like any other ordinary flight, with passengers hustling to find their seats and prepare for a long journey ahead. The plane was a few minutes away from takeoff, and the flight attendants were going through their usual routine. Among the crowd of travelers, one woman stood out. A teacher named Ms. Jackson, traveling from New York to attend an education conference in California. She was a woman in her mid-30s, wearing a professional yet comfortable outfit, her eyes scanning the aisle as she made her way to her seat. She had been looking forward to the trip for months, hoping to gain new insights and ideas to bring back to her classroom. But what happened next wasn't something she could have ever prepared for. As she settled into her seat, Ms. Jackson adjusted the recliner to get more comfortable. The flight was long, and she had a stiff back from a recent injury. She didn't think it was a big deal when she politely asked the flight attendant, a woman in her early 40s with a stern look on her face, to help her with the seat. "Could you just adjust it a little? I'm having some back pain," Ms. Jackson explained, her voice calm and polite. At first, the flight attendant seemed fine. She nodded and made her way over. But then something shifted. Maybe it was the long hours of work, or maybe it was just the wrong kind of day. Instead of helping, the attendant looked at her coldly and said, "This is how it is. You'll have to deal with it." Ms. Jackson, surprised but trying to stay patient, asked again, "I understand, but can you please just make it a little more comfortable?" She wasn't asking for much, just a slight adjustment. But the flight attendant's response was sharp. "You should have thought about that before you booked the seat." For a moment, the atmosphere between them was tense, but it didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary. After all, a minor disagreement between a passenger and an attendant wasn't anything new. Ms. Jackson, trying to keep things calm, was about to say something else when the flight attendant, without warning, leaned in and slapped her across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the cabin and everything seemed to freeze. Passengers looked up from their seats, some with their mouths open in disbelief, others with their eyes wide in shock. Ms. Jackson, her hand instinctively reaching for her cheek, stood up slowly. It was a moment that no one expected, and no one would forget. For a brief moment, there was nothing but silence. Ms. Jackson stood there, her hand pressed against her cheek, still trying to process what had just happened. The slap wasn't just physical. It was the sheer audacity of it that left her frozen. She hadn't done anything to provoke the flight attendant, and yet she had been slapped in front of everyone. The passengers around her were equally stunned. Some of them glanced nervously at each other, unsure whether to speak up or stay quiet. Others quickly turned their attention back to their own seats, pretending they hadn't witnessed what was unfolding before them. Ms. Jackson, however, didn't flinch. She didn't shout or cry. She simply looked at the flight attendant, her voice calm but firm. "I want to speak to the captain," she said, making it clear that this was not something she would just let slide. The flight attendant, taken aback for a moment, quickly tried to recover. "It was just a misunderstanding," she said, brushing it off as though it were nothing. But the damage had been done. Ms. Jackson wasn't going to let this go. She walked toward the front of the plane, her steps deliberate. The flight attendant watched her, still acting as if nothing had happened. But the tension in the air was palpable. Passengers were starting to murmur among themselves, whispering about what they had just seen. Some felt uncomfortable, while others felt angry on behalf of Ms. Jackson. But no one seemed to know exactly what to do. When Ms. Jackson reached the cockpit door, she knocked firmly. The door opened and she calmly explained what had happened. The captain, a man in his 50s with a stern demeanor, listened intently. He didn't interrupt her, just nodded as she described the slap and how the situation had escalated. After a moment of silence, the captain stood up and made a decision. "I'll be right back," he said, and disappeared into the main cabin. Meanwhile, the flight attendant was still standing by her station, clearly trying to play it off as if everything was fine. She wasn't expecting the captain's response, and she certainly wasn't prepared for what was about to happen next. Minutes passed, but to Ms. Jackson it felt like hours. The tension in the cabin was growing thicker by the second. Passengers were starting to notice the exchange between the teacher and the flight attendant, some whispering quietly, others watching the situation unfold. A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of what to do. But no one spoke up yet, not until the captain returned. He walked down the aisle, his presence commanding immediate attention. His expression was serious, and when he reached Ms. Jackson, he didn't waste any time. Without a word, he turned to the flight attendant, who had now started to look a bit uneasy. "You need to come with me," the captain said firmly. There was no room for negotiation. The flight attendant hesitated, her face turning red as she glanced back at the passengers watching her. She knew the eyes of the entire plane were on her now, and for the first time she seemed to realize the severity of her actions. Ms. Jackson stood still, her back straight and her posture unshaken. She hadn't expected the captain to act so quickly, but she was relieved. The slap had been humiliating, but this moment, this decision, was a small victory in a situation that had quickly spiraled out of control. The flight attendant, on the other hand, was stunned. She had clearly thought that her position would shield her from any real consequences. But now, as the captain gestured for her to leave, she was faced with the reality of what she had done. "Is everything okay?" one of the passengers asked Miss Jackson, her voice soft but concerned. Miss Jackson turned to her and gave a small nod. "It will be," she said quietly, though her voice held a certain level of calmness that didn't match the chaos of the situation. The passengers were now more focused on the unfolding drama. Some were exchanging looks, some were on their phones, probably wondering how the situation would end. But everyone could feel the weight of the moment. The flight attendant, once in control, was now being escorted off the plane. The captain, now in control of the situation, returned to the front of the plane and made an announcement over the intercom. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of authority in it. "Ladies and gentlemen, we regret to inform you that due to an unforeseen situation, we are unable to continue with the current crew member. We are making arrangements for a replacement, and we appreciate your understanding as we handle this matter." Ms. Jackson's eyes widened slightly at the announcement. She didn't expect the captain to be this direct, but she couldn't help but feel a small sense of justice. The flight attendant had crossed a line, and now she was paying the price. But this wasn't over. The tension in the cabin remained, and the passengers could tell that there was more to this story than what they had seen. As the captain disappeared once again to handle the situation, the murmurs in the cabin grew louder. What would happen next? Would the flight attendant return? Would there be consequences for her actions? And more importantly, how would the rest of the flight play out with everything that had just happened? For Ms. Jackson, this was far from the relaxing trip she had imagined, but at least, for now, she was standing tall. The minutes felt endless, as the captain and crew dealt with the situation in the background. Ms. Jackson remained in her seat, her eyes fixed ahead, though her mind was racing. She couldn't help but replay the moment over and over, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The slap, the way the flight attendant had reacted. It was as if the entire situation had spiraled out of control in the blink of an eye. It wasn't just about the physical act. It was the sheer disrespect and the unexpected nature of it all. Around her, the other passengers seemed just as unsettled. Some whispered amongst themselves, exchanging stories about how they had witnessed similar things before, but never quite like this. A few others, who had been quiet at first, were now looking at Ms. Jackson with a mix of sympathy and curiosity. But despite their quiet murmurs, no one seemed ready to speak up or challenge the situation. It was clear that something had shifted in the atmosphere of the flight, and everyone was now waiting for what would happen next. Then, as if the tension in the cabin couldn't get any thicker, The captain reappeared, this time with a different flight attendant by his side. She was much younger, with a kind, apologetic look on her face as she made her way to the front of the plane. The original flight attendant, now standing off to the side, had been escorted to the gate. She wasn't coming back. It was obvious that the situation had been taken seriously. The new flight attendant, trying to ease the discomfort in the air, began her introduction to the passengers, her voice soft and professional. "Good afternoon, everyone. I'm your new flight attendant for this journey. I'm here to make sure the rest of your flight is as smooth and pleasant as possible. If there's anything I can do to assist, please don't hesitate to ask." Her tone was reassuring, but it was clear that the passengers were still processing the chaos that had unfolded just moments ago. Ms. Jackson, though still shaken, felt a sense of relief. She knew the flight had to continue, but at least now the immediate tension was gone. She returned her gaze to the window, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling of being the center of attention. She wanted to forget about the incident, but deep down, she knew it wasn't something she could easily move past. This was something that would stay with her, not just because of the slap, but because of how it had made her feel. The disregard, the humiliation, the sheer disregard for basic respect. And yet, even as the new flight attendant moved about the cabin, passing out refreshments and offering assistance, there was a growing sense of unease among the passengers. Ms. Jackson could sense it. She could feel the eyes on her, some still curious, some with judgment, others perhaps still processing what they had just witnessed. But as the plane finally began its ascent into the sky, the world outside seemed to offer her a moment of calm. The clouds stretched out beneath them, and for a brief second, it felt like everything would be okay. But that wasn't the end of it. It was only the beginning. The passengers, the flight crew, and even Ms. Jackson herself had no idea that this incident would spark a series of events that would ripple far beyond the confines of this single flight. This wasn't just about an altercation between a teacher and a flight attendant. It was about a moment of reckoning, one that no one would forget. As the plane continued its climb into the sky, the usual hum of the engines seemed almost deafening after the silence that had followed the confrontation. Ms. Jackson leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment. She needed to breathe. She needed a moment to process what had happened. The sting on her cheek was fading, but the humiliation and confusion lingered. She wasn't just hurt by the slap itself, but by the audacity of the flight attendant, the way she'd dismissed her so casually, as though she wasn't even worth a basic level of courtesy or respect. Around her, things seemed to settle down, though there was still an undeniable tension. The new flight attendant moved through the cabin, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers. Some people kept their eyes down, focusing on their phones or books, while others continued to whisper quietly. It was clear that many were still processing what they had seen. But as the new attendant passed, a few passengers turned to Ms. Jackson, offering subtle nods or small gestures of support. It wasn't much, but it helped to ease the sting, knowing that at least some people understood how wrong it had been. But just as Ms. Jackson began to think the worst was behind her, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text message from a friend. "Are you okay? I just saw a video of what happened on the plane." Her heart sank. She didn't have to ask how or why the video was already out there. Within minutes of the altercation, someone on the flight had captured the slap on their phone and uploaded it. The video was now spreading like wildfire on social media. As she opened the message, she saw a link to a video titled "Flight Attendant Slaps Teacher Over Seat Adjustment." The thumbnail showed a blurry image of her, standing in the aisle, her hand to her cheek, and the flight attendant in the background. The video was only a few seconds long, but the clip was enough to capture the shocking moment. Ms. Jackson's face was clearly visible in the video, her expression a mix of surprise and disbelief. It was raw and unfiltered. She didn't want to watch it. She couldn't bring herself to. But she knew that once something like this was out there was no taking it back. The video would be shared, commented on, and judged by thousands of people, most of whom had no idea what had led up to this moment. It was just a snapshot of a brief, heated moment, but it had already gone viral. The comment section was flooded with mixed reactions. Some people were siding with Ms. Jackson, calling out the flight attendant's behavior as outrageous, while others were questioning whether the teacher had been too sensitive or had provoked the situation. But the video wasn't just affecting Ms. Jackson emotionally, it was also gaining attention from the media. By the time the flight reached cruising altitude, reporters were already picking up the story. Articles started appearing online with headlines like, "Shocking Airline Incident," "Flight Attendant Slaps Teacher Over Seat Issue," and "Caught on Camera, the Flight Attendant Who Lost Control." The story was spreading faster than anyone could have imagined. Ms. Jackson felt a knot in her stomach. She hadn't signed up for any of this. She just wanted to get to her conference and move on with her life. But now, her name was being shared across the internet, linked to an incident that was both shocking and embarrassing. And the flight attendant, well, she had become a subject of public ridicule. But as Ms. Jackson sat there watching the notifications flood her phone, something shifted inside her. She realized that the situation had taken a life of its own, and there was nothing she could do to change the fact that it had gone viral. The only thing she could control now was how she reacted. Would she let this moment define her, or would she find a way to turn it into something that could spark change? The plane continued its steady flight, and though the chaos was still fresh in her mind, Ms. Jackson knew that this wasn't over yet. She couldn't predict what would come next, but one thing was for sure. This incident was going to have a much bigger impact than she had ever imagined. The question was, what would that impact be? By the time the plane reached its cruising altitude, the incident had already begun to ripple through the public. Ms. Jackson kept her phone in her lap, unable to escape the flood of messages and notifications that seemed to come with every passing second. She could feel the weight of the situation, as though the eyes of the world were already on her. People were talking, debating, and commenting on the video, dissecting every frame. She knew the story would be all over the news by the time she landed, but what she hadn't expected was how quickly everything would escalate. Soon, the flight attendants began to speak in hushed tones among themselves. The new attendant, who had replaced the one who was escorted off the plane, seemed to be walking with an air of quiet authority, but even she couldn't hide the tension. A few passengers had already begun to whisper to her, asking for details. The situation had turned into more than just a viral video. It was now a full-blown story, one that would likely end up in newspapers and TV segments. Ms. Jackson noticed a group of passengers a few rows ahead, gathered around a tablet, watching the video in real time. A few of them looked back at her with expressions that ranged from sympathy to curiosity. Some gave her a subtle nod of support, while others seemed unsure how to react. She felt uncomfortable being the focal point, but at the same time, there was something empowering about seeing others speak up in her defense. As the flight continued, she couldn't help but think about how quickly things had gone from bad to worse. At first, it had just been a simple seat adjustment request. Then, it had turned into an altercation. And now, it was a viral scandal that could potentially change her life. She hadn't planned for this. Nobody ever plans for something like this. But she couldn't deny that the attention it was getting was overwhelming. When the captain returned to make another announcement, his voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be making an unscheduled stop at the next airport to refuel. We will be briefly delayed as we adjust our flight path. We appreciate your understanding." It wasn't long before Ms. Jackson understood the real reason for the detour. The flight wasn't being delayed for fuel. It was being delayed for another reason: an official investigation into the incident. Soon, a team of airline security personnel, along with a representative from the airline's customer service, made their way down the aisle. They approached Ms. Jackson quietly, their presence commanding attention. "Ms. Jackson, we're very sorry for what you've gone through today," one of them said, his voice professional but apologetic. "We'll be making sure you're taken care of during the remainder of the flight. We're also taking immediate action regarding the flight attendant's behavior. We just need to take your statement." It was clear that the airline was trying to distance itself from the situation. They were doing everything they could to show that they didn't condone what had happened. But Ms. Jackson felt a mix of emotions: relief, anger, and even a sense of disbelief that all of this was happening. They asked her about the altercation, documenting every detail, every word that had been exchanged. But deep down, she knew that nothing could truly erase the sting of the slap. While they spoke with her, a few of the other passengers were being questioned as well. Their accounts varied, but the consensus was the same. The flight attendant's behavior had been completely out of line. Some passengers even mentioned how they felt the tension building long before the slap occurred. Many had seen Ms. Jackson ask for a simple adjustment, and some had heard the flight attendant's sharp response. But it was the slap that everyone kept coming back to. By the time the airline staff finished taking her statement, Ms. Jackson couldn't help but feel a strange mix of exhaustion and resolve. She had come onto this flight as a teacher, a professional woman just looking to do her job and attend a conference. Now, she was caught in the middle of a viral controversy that could follow her for much longer than she'd ever imagined. The rest of the flight was uneventful, but the tension was palpable. The new flight attendant moved through the aisles more cautiously now, her demeanor subdued. The airline staff was clearly trying to smooth things over, offering apologies and reassurances. But Ms. Jackson knew that things wouldn't be so easily forgotten. She had become a symbol of something much bigger than herself, something that extended beyond the borders of that plane. By the time the plane finally began its descent toward their destination, Ms. Jackson found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. It wasn't just about the slap anymore. It was about how people, strangers even, were now weighing in on the situation. And it was about how quickly a single moment could transform into something that affected not just her, but the lives of everyone on that flight. She wasn't sure what would happen next. But one thing was certain. The story wasn't over. And it was only just beginning to unfold. When the plane finally touched down, Ms. Jackson felt the weight of the past few hours pressing down on her. The turbulence she'd experienced during the flight now seemed like a distant memory compared to the emotional storm she was navigating. As the plane taxied to the gate, the hum of the engines became almost deafening, but it did nothing to drown out the noise in her head. The reality of the situation was sinking in. She was about to step off this plane not just as a passenger, but as a central figure in a controversy that had already caught the public's eye. She had hoped to leave the chaos behind in the sky, but the moment she stepped off the plane, she was met by airport staff who were waiting for her by the jet bridge. Several uniformed individuals, some from the airline, others in plain clothes, were there to meet her, their faces professional, but their presence felt invasive. They were apologetic, offering their sincerest regrets. But there was an underlying sense of formality that made it clear this was more than just a typical customer service response. "Ms. Jackson," one of the staff members said, "we'll be escorting you through the terminal. The airline has arranged for a private space where you can gather your thoughts. We understand this has been a very stressful experience." Ms. Jackson nodded, trying to remain calm, though her mind was racing. She had imagined arriving at her conference with excitement and anticipation, but now everything had changed. Her phone buzzed again, this time with an alert from a news outlet. "Flight attendant slaps teacher. Viral video sparks outrage." It seemed that the incident had exploded in the media, with articles now flooding her notifications. She knew she had to address the situation somehow, but she hadn't expected it to unfold so quickly. The story wasn't just trending, it was everywhere. As she was escorted through the terminal, she couldn't help but notice the subtle glances from other passengers who had been on the flight. Some of them looked at her with sympathy, others with curiosity. It felt as though the entire world knew her story already, and she hadn't even had a chance to fully process what had happened. The airport was bustling, but there was an odd kind of quiet around her as she moved through the crowd, as if the world had shifted its focus. When they reached the private room, Ms. Jackson was finally given a moment to herself. She sat down in a chair, her hands trembling slightly as she looked at her phone once again. The media was already spinning the narrative, some outlets framing it as a shocking example of airline misconduct, while others seemed to question whether the flight attendant's actions had been justified. The comments on social media ranged from outrage to disbelief, with some defending the teacher, while others pointed fingers at her for escalating the situation. It was a whirlwind of opinions, and everyone seemed to have their own take on what had happened. But what struck her the most was the focus on the flight attendant's behavior. Yes, the video showed the slap, but it was the broader issue that seemed to be gaining more traction. The airline was facing mounting pressure, with activists, bloggers, and even ordinary people demanding answers. The conversation was no longer just about the flight, it was about accountability. And as much as she didn't want to be part of that narrative, she was now at the center of it. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. One of the airline's representatives stepped in, a concerned look on their face. "Ms. Jackson, I just wanted to check in and make sure you're okay. We've arranged for you to be taken to your hotel, but we also understand you may want to speak with our legal team before anything else happens." She looked up at the representative, feeling the weight of the situation. Legal team? This had escalated further than she had ever imagined. Ms. Jackson wasn't sure if she was ready for what was coming next. She didn't want to fight, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized this wasn't just about her. It was about what she had been subjected to, and the mistreatment she had experienced on that flight. "I just want to be left alone for now," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I need time to think." The representative nodded and stepped out, leaving her alone once again. Ms. Jackson stared at the screen of her phone, now filled with messages from friends and colleagues offering their support. It was comforting, but also overwhelming. She wasn't just going to be remembered for her work as a teacher anymore. She was now tied to a viral scandal that would follow her. But deep down, something inside her told her this wasn't over yet. There was more to this story, and she hadn't decided how she was going to handle it. For now, though, she needed to process everything. She needed to make some decisions about what came next, and whether she was ready to take on the fight that had just begun. The door clicked open again, but this time it wasn't just another airline rep. Standing there was a familiar face, a reporter who had somehow made his way past the barriers. "Ms. Jackson," he said with a calm but determined voice, "I'm from a news outlet, and we'd like to get your side of the story. Can we talk?" And just like that, the story she never asked for was about to take another unexpected turn. Ms. Jackson sat there for a long moment, her heart racing as she tried to process the situation. The reporter's face was familiar. She had seen him on TV before, covering major news stories. His presence in the room, along with the camera equipment he had with him, made her feel as though she were on display. For a brief second, she considered saying no, turning him away and sticking to her plan of staying out of the spotlight. But something inside her told her this wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't just about the slap or the embarrassment. It was about accountability, about making sure this didn't get swept under the rug. With a deep breath, she nodded. "Okay, we can talk," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She wasn't sure where to begin, but she knew that how she responded in this moment could shape how everything unfolded from here. The reporter smiled, sensing her willingness to speak. He moved closer, his camera crew already setting up behind him. "Thank you for agreeing to this. I know it's been a long day, but we just want to hear your side. Can you walk us through what happened on that flight?" Ms. Jackson hesitated. She could feel her emotions bubbling up again, but she took another deep breath and started speaking. "I was just on the plane, trying to get to my conference. I'm a teacher and this was supposed to be a work trip. But when I asked the flight attendant to adjust my seat, things escalated so quickly I didn't even know what was happening. She told me to deal with it, that there was nothing she could do, and then she slapped me." Her voice wavered a little as she said the last part, but she forced herself to continue. "I didn't ask for a fight, I didn't raise my voice. I was just asking for some help, like any reasonable person would. But she slapped me, and I don't think anyone should have to go through something like that. Not in any job, not in any situation." The reporter listened carefully, his pen moving across the notepad as he took down notes. "That sounds awful," he said, his tone sympathetic but professional. "And how did the rest of the flight crew respond once it happened?" Ms. Jackson hesitated again, but this time she was more certain. "The captain came over and they removed her from the flight. I didn't expect that. I thought maybe there would be some kind of discussion, but they acted quickly. They apologized to me, but I'm not sure if that's enough. The airline's response so far has been, I don't know, reactive, not proactive. I didn't want to be the story, but now that it's out there, I need to make sure this doesn't happen again." The reporter nodded, a serious look on his face. "Do you think the flight attendant was acting out of anger, or was there something else at play? What do you think led to this?" Ms. Jackson paused for a moment, thinking carefully about her answer. "I don't know what was going on with her, but it felt personal. I don't know if she was having a bad day or if it was something else, but I know this. No one should treat another person that way, no matter what. She could have just helped me, or at the very least talked to me calmly, but she chose violence, and that's not okay." The reporter's expression softened a little, though he remained focused. "So, do you think this was an isolated incident? Or do you think this kind of behavior is more widespread in the airline industry?" Ms. Jackson's mind flashed back to the time she had spent working with students, guiding them through challenging situations, helping them learn how to communicate respectfully. "It's hard to say. But I know this isn't the first time something like this has happened. There are countless stories of poor customer service, of people being mistreated by workers in positions of power. But that doesn't mean it's okay. That doesn't mean it should be ignored. And that's what I want to change." The reporter leaned back slightly, clearly impressed by her response. "So, you want accountability?" "I do," Ms. Jackson said firmly, her voice growing more confident with each word. "I want people to know that there are consequences when you treat others badly, not just for the person who's hurt, but for the culture that allows it to happen. We need to hold ourselves to a higher standard." The reporter paused for a moment, then looked up, his gaze thoughtful. "I think that's a powerful message, Ms. Jackson, and I'm sure many people will agree with you. Thank you for sharing your side of the story. We'll make sure to report this accurately." As the camera crew packed up their equipment, Ms. Jackson sat back in her chair, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. She had said what she needed to say. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had become the voice for something bigger than herself, something that could, hopefully, bring about change. When the interview was over, the reporter gave her a quick nod before leaving the room, and Ms. Jackson was left alone again, her phone still buzzing with messages. But this time there was something different in the air. The fear of the unknown, the anxiety about what would come next, had faded a little. She had faced the situation head-on. She had taken control of her story, and now she was ready to see where it would go. After the reporter left, the room felt quieter, almost suffocatingly so. Ms. Jackson sat alone, the weight of the interview still settling in her chest. She had spoken her truth, but now the reality of what lay ahead hit her all at once. The news about the slap had spread faster than she could have imagined, and now it was part of a much bigger conversation. The airline, the flight attendant, the passengers, everyone was involved in some way. But more importantly, so was she. The simple act of being slapped had turned into a media storm, and she was now an unwilling symbol of a deeper issue, one that went beyond just her personal experience. Her phone buzzed again, this time a message from her close friend Carla, a colleague who had taught alongside her for years. "I saw your interview. You were amazing. But are you okay? What's going on? I can't believe this is happening." Carla's message was filled with both concern and admiration, and as Ms. Jackson read it, she felt the familiar pang of uncertainty. Was she okay? Physically, yes. Emotionally? That was harder to answer. She typed back, "I don't know. It's been a lot, but I had to say something. I couldn't let this go. Thanks for checking in." The reality of being in the public eye was something she had never asked for, and it was overwhelming. Every time she opened her phone, there was a new headline, a new comment. Some were supportive, others were critical, and some were downright cruel. She must have done something to provoke it, one person commented. She's just looking for attention, another wrote. But there were also dozens of others who stood behind her, condemning the flight attendant's actions and praising her courage. Good for her, standing up for herself, one supporter wrote. This shouldn't be happening to anyone. But the more she read, the more she realized how divisive the issue had become. What was supposed to be a simple flight had now sparked a nationwide debate about power dynamics, customer service, and respect. It was clear that some people saw the flight attendant's actions as a result of a larger, systemic problem within the airline industry. Others, however, saw the situation as an isolated incident blown out of proportion. And then, there were those who simply couldn't fathom that someone in the service industry could lose their temper so publicly. In the midst of it all, Ms. Jackson couldn't help but feel like a pawn in a game she didn't even know she was playing. Despite the mixed responses, Ms. Jackson knew she had done the right thing by speaking up. It wasn't just about her personal experience. It was about creating a conversation, shedding light on the ways people in power could treat others, and how those actions had far-reaching consequences. She didn't want the story to end with her being just another viral sensation. She wanted it to lead to something more. As she sat in the small, sterile airport room, her mind wandered to the bigger picture. She thought about her students, the ones she taught every day, the ones she worked so hard for. They were learning about respect, about kindness, about standing up for what's right. And here she was, trying to model that same behavior in the most unexpected of circumstances. The thoughts of her students gave her a little more resolve. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been mistreated, ignored, or made to feel small. And while she didn't know how far this would go, or how it would all unfold, she knew she had to keep pushing forward. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to find another airline representative standing there, holding a folder in his hands. He had a calm, almost apologetic look on his face. "Ms. Jackson, I hope you're doing all right. We've arranged for your hotel accommodations, as we discussed earlier. We also have our legal team here, should you want to discuss any further actions or concerns regarding what happened on the flight." Ms. Jackson nodded, though her heart wasn't in it. "Thank you," she said quietly. She wasn't sure if she was ready to talk to a legal team just yet. She needed time to process everything, time to think through what kind of action, if any, she wanted to take. Right now, all she could think about was how overwhelming this had all become. The representative paused, noticing the exhaustion in her face. "If you'd like, we can have someone speak to you later, at your convenience, but of course we'll respect whatever decision you make." With that, he handed her a card with his contact information and left the room, leaving her alone once again. Ms. Jackson stared at the card for a moment. Legal teams, follow-up meetings, media inquiries. This was turning into something much bigger than she had anticipated. She hadn't come on this flight to start a crusade or to become a spokesperson for anything. But it seemed that's where things were heading, and now there was no turning back. After a few minutes of silence, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email. She opened it to find a message from the conference organizers. They had heard about the incident and were offering their support, assuring her that her participation in the conference was still welcome. But the email also included a more unexpected offer, the chance to speak at the event about her experience. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had come to the conference to learn and grow as an educator, but now she was being asked to share her story with hundreds of people, most of whom didn't know her from a stranger. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that, but it was an opportunity she couldn't ignore. The idea of speaking up, not just for herself, but for others, suddenly felt important. As she closed her laptop and looked out the window at the airport terminal, she realized something. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The slap, the flight, the media frenzy. They were all just the beginning of a much larger conversation. And while she still wasn't sure where it would lead, she knew that whatever came next, She couldn't walk away. The fight for respect, dignity, and accountability was just getting started. And this time, she was ready to see it through. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, media inquiries, and messages from friends, colleagues, and strangers alike. Ms. Jackson had found herself at the center of a whirlwind, and there was no escaping it. Every time she picked up her phone, there was another notification, another headline, another comment. News outlets were picking up the story in droves, some sensationalizing the incident, others focusing on the deeper questions it raised about customer service, workplace behavior, and the treatment of passengers in the airline industry. At first, the constant barrage of attention made her feel like she was drowning. She was just one person, a teacher, a regular person, caught in the middle of a media storm she never asked for. But as the days passed, something inside her began to shift. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was thinking. She was strategizing. And slowly, she started to realize that this situation could be turned into something much more powerful, something that could actually make a difference. The conference organizers had followed up, reiterating their support and offering her a platform to speak. They wanted her to give a keynote address on her experience, on what it meant to stand up for yourself, to demand respect, and to take action when confronted with injustice. She hesitated at first. The idea of speaking in front of hundreds of people, sharing a deeply personal and painful experience, was overwhelming. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that it was a chance for her to take control of the narrative. She wasn't just a victim of an unfortunate incident. She was a teacher, a leader, someone who had the ability to influence others. She could use this moment to help others who felt powerless, who had been dismissed or ignored, to stand up for themselves. She could turn this viral story into a conversation about respect, about how we treat each other in both personal and professional spaces. But before she could step onto that stage, she knew she needed to gather her thoughts and figure out exactly what she wanted to say. She started writing. She wrote about her experience on the flight, the slap, the surprise, the confusion. But more importantly, she wrote about the emotions that followed, the humiliation, the disbelief, the overwhelming sense of being made small. And then she wrote about the realization that came soon after, that this was about more than just one flight attendant's behavior. This was about a broader issue that needed to be addressed, the way people in positions of power often treat others with disrespect, the way a single act of violence could shatter someone's sense of dignity. As she wrote, she began to feel a sense of clarity. The rage and humiliation she had initially felt were still there, but now they were being channeled into something more constructive. Her words took shape as a powerful statement on the importance of respect, equality, and accountability, no matter the setting. She wasn't just telling her story, she was calling for change. Meanwhile, the story continued to unfold in the media. The airline had launched an internal investigation into the flight attendants' actions, but there was little new information. Some passengers who had been on the flight were now speaking out, offering their own accounts of the incident. The general consensus was clear. The flight attendant had acted out of line. But there were also more voices speaking up about the systemic issues in customer service jobs, particularly in industries like airlines, where employees are often overworked and underpaid. Many were questioning whether the pressure and stress of the job had contributed to the attendant's outburst. But despite the media frenzy, Ms. Jackson knew that the story would eventually fade from the headlines. News cycles moved quickly, and soon the incident would become just another viral moment people would forget. That was why she had to make sure her message wasn't lost in the noise. This wasn't just about the slap or the flight. It was about creating a conversation that lasted beyond the viral video, beyond the trending hashtags. It was about using her voice to create lasting change. Her decision to speak at the conference became a turning point. She would go, not just to share her experience, but to advocate for something much larger. She would stand on that stage not just as a teacher, but as a person who had been through something that had shaken her to the core, and who had come out stronger because of it. She was ready to speak about the impact of disrespect in any professional setting, and to challenge everyone in the room to think about how they treated others, how they treated people in service jobs, in low-paying roles, and in positions where they felt powerless. The night before the conference, she sat in her hotel room going over her notes one last time. She wasn't nervous, but there was an undeniable weight to the moment. Tomorrow, she would be speaking in front of an audience full of educators, professionals, and industry leaders. Some of them were probably expecting her to just talk about her personal story, how she had been slapped by a flight attendant. But she knew that wasn't enough. She had a bigger message to deliver. She stood in front of the mirror, taking a deep breath. The woman staring back at her wasn't the same woman who had boarded that flight just a few days ago. She wasn't the same woman who had been slapped and humiliated in front of a plane full of people. No, she was someone stronger, someone who had turned that painful experience into a call for change. She wasn't just a victim. She was a voice for others who had been treated unfairly, and she wasn't going to stop until people started listening. Tomorrow, she would take the stage, and she would make sure her message was heard loud and clear. The morning of the conference arrived, and Ms. Jackson stood at the podium, her hands resting on the cool, smooth wood. The bright stage lights washed over her, and the hum of the crowd slowly faded into the background. She felt the weight of the room's expectations pressing on her, but at the same time a sense of calm had settled over her. She wasn't just here to talk about what happened to her. She wasn't here to rehash the slap or the humiliation or the viral video. She was here to speak about something much more important, how we treat each other, especially those who are often treated like they don't matter. As she glanced out at the audience, she saw a sea of faces, some curious, some supportive, and some skeptical. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. She had spent countless hours thinking about this moment, crafting her speech, honing her message, and now, it was time to share it. She could feel the nerves in her stomach, but they weren't overwhelming anymore. This wasn't just about her story. It was about everyone who had ever been disrespected, dismissed, or made to feel small, and this was her moment to speak for them. She took a deep breath and began. "Good morning, everyone," Ms. Jackson started, her voice steady. "I'm here today to talk about an experience I never expected to have. A few days ago, I was on a plane, minding my own business, traveling to a professional conference. I'm a teacher, and I was excited to learn new things that would help me do my job better. But what happened on that plane wasn't something I could have prepared for." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the room. There were a few subtle shifts in the audience, people adjusting in their seats, leaning forward, paying attention. She continued. "I was seated in an aisle seat, and my back was hurting. I asked the flight attendant for a simple adjustment to my seat. I didn't ask for much, just a little help. But the flight attendant, instead of responding with understanding or kindness, dismissed me. She told me to deal with it, and when I asked again, she slapped me, in front of a plane full of people." There was a slight gasp from the crowd. Ms. Jackson's heart beat faster, but she held her ground. This wasn't just about the shock of the slap. It was about what followed. I stood there, stunned. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to escalate things, but I also didn't want to let this go. I asked to speak to the captain, and within minutes, the flight attendant was escorted off the plane. The airline immediately began an internal investigation, and I was offered an apology. But for me, that wasn't enough. It wasn't just about what happened on that plane. It was about the way I had been treated. Like I didn't matter. Like my comfort, my dignity didn't count. She paused again, her eyes scanning the crowd. She could see the curiosity on some faces, the sympathy on others. But more than anything, she saw the potential for change. This wasn't just a personal story. It was a conversation about something much bigger. The incident on the plane may have started with a small, personal request, she continued. But it grew into something much larger because of how the flight attendant responded. And it's not just about this one flight. This is part of a bigger issue we face in society. How we treat people, particularly those in service jobs, those in roles where they're expected to serve others. We tend to forget that the people we interact with, the people serving us, are humans just like us. They have their struggles, their bad days, their frustrations. But that doesn't give anyone the right to treat them like they're less than. Ms. Jackson felt a surge of energy, the words flowing more freely now. She was no longer nervous. She was passionate, determined to make this moment count. For those of you in this room who are in positions of power, whether you're a manager, a leader, a professional, remember that every person you interact with is deserving of respect. No one should ever feel invisible or inferior, no matter their job title or their station in life. The flight attendant may have been having a bad day, but that doesn't excuse what happened. What we do when we feel powerless is just as important as what we do when we feel in control. She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was silent. Every ear tuned in, every eye focused on her. She knew that some in the audience were still processing what she had said, still grappling with the impact of her story. But she was convinced now more than ever, this was bigger than one flight. It was about how we treat each other every day. "I'm not here to demonize anyone," she said, her voice softening but still firm. "I don't want to blame the flight attendant for everything that went wrong. But I do want to say this. We need to start treating each other better. We need to remember that every single person we encounter, whether they're serving us food, cleaning our rooms, checking us into a hotel, or flying a plane, is a human being, and they deserve to be treated with the same dignity and respect that we expect for ourselves." There was a moment of silence before the first applause broke out. It wasn't thunderous, but it was real, genuine. People were nodding along, some even wiping away tears. Ms. Jackson's eyes welled up, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. This was her moment to make a difference. "Let's remember that we're all part of this world together," she said, her voice now filled with a quiet strength. "And the way we treat each other, not just the people in the seats next to us, but the people who serve us, the people who make our lives easier, that matters. I hope that moving forward, we can all work to create a world where kindness, respect, and understanding are the norm, not the exception." The room erupted into applause, louder this time, and Ms. Jackson, standing tall at the podium, felt a rush of emotions, relief, gratitude, but most of all, pride. She had come into this room unsure of what her words would do, unsure of whether they would make any difference at all. But now, as she looked out at the sea of faces, some smiling, some contemplative, she knew that her story was no longer just her own. It had become something that could spark change, something that could ripple out and affect how people interacted with each other, not just in airports or on planes, but everywhere. She wasn't just a teacher. She was a voice for those who had been dismissed, ignored, and mistreated. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The applause continued as she stepped away from the podium, but it was the conversations that followed, both with the people she spoke to that day and the ones who would carry her message forward, that truly made her realize the power of her words. This was just the beginning. She had sparked a conversation that needed to be had, and now it was time to keep it going. The days following her keynote speech at the conference felt surreal to Ms. Jackson. She had been anticipating some level of feedback, perhaps a few supportive comments, a thank you or two for sharing her story. But what she didn't expect was the tidal wave of support that came crashing in from all sides. Emails flooded her inbox, social media posts poured in from every direction, and the phone calls kept coming. She had opened the door to a much larger conversation than she had ever imagined, and now people were responding in ways she hadn't expected. Many of the messages were from people who had seen the video of the slap and followed her journey. They thanked her for speaking out, for giving them a voice. Others shared their own stories, stories of being mistreated by customer service workers, or having their dignity stripped away in a similar manner. Some were teachers like her. Others were service workers, nurses, or just everyday people who had been in situations where they felt powerless. There was a sense of unity in these messages, as if Ms. Jackson had unwittingly sparked a conversation that many people had been too afraid to have. But not all the messages were positive. There were still those who questioned her motives, who called her weak for crying over a slap, or accused her of turning a small incident into a public spectacle. Some even said that the flight attendant must have had a reason for losing her temper. It was hard for Ms. Jackson to ignore the negativity, but she tried to focus on the messages that mattered most, the ones from people who were genuinely grateful for her courage, for using her experience to stand up for something bigger than herself. One message, in particular, stood out among the rest. It came from a woman named Maria, a flight attendant with over 15 years of experience. Maria shared that she had been following the story closely and wanted to reach out personally. In her message, she expressed empathy for Ms. Jackson's experience and offered some insight into what might have contributed to the flight attendant's behavior. "I'm not defending what happened," Maria wrote, "but I think it's important to understand that many of us in the service industry are under constant stress. We're asked to do more with less, and it takes a toll on our mental and emotional well-being. I've seen incidents like this in my career, and while they're not excusable, they're often a result of frustration and burnout." Ms. Jackson paused for a moment as she read the message. She had never considered the stress and burnout that many service workers, including flight attendants, might be facing. She had been so focused on her own experience that she hadn't thought about how the environment around the flight attendant could have contributed to her outburst. But Maria's message wasn't just an excuse for the behavior. It was an invitation to dig deeper, to consider the larger systemic issues that impacted both passengers and service workers alike. For the first time, Ms. Jackson started to think about the issue from multiple angles. It wasn't just about the flight attendant's actions. It was about the culture of the airline industry, the expectations placed on employees, and the lack of support that many frontline workers received. She realized that her story wasn't just a call for respect for passengers. It was also a call for better working conditions and support for the people who were on the front lines every day. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the conversation needed to be broader. This wasn't just about one flight attendant, or one passenger's experience. It was about the treatment of workers across industries and the importance of mental health, respect, and support in high-pressure jobs. Ms. Jackson decided to respond to Maria. She thanked her for her honesty and for shedding light on the challenges that service workers often face. She acknowledged that while nothing could excuse what had happened, the broader issue of worker burnout and stress was something that needed to be addressed. Maria responded almost immediately, thanking Ms. Jackson for her understanding and agreeing that more needed to be done to advocate for better working conditions in the airline industry. "Maybe we can work together to raise awareness about this," Maria wrote. "Maybe your story can help people see the bigger picture." It was a moment of clarity for Ms. Jackson. She had started this journey thinking it was just about her experience and the mistreatment she had endured. But now, she saw that it was much more than that. She wasn't just advocating for respect for passengers. She was advocating for the people who had to bear the brunt of the stress and pressure in customer service roles. She began to formulate ideas about how she could use her platform to push for better working conditions for those in service jobs. She thought about writing articles, speaking at conferences not just for teachers, but for people in all types of frontline work, and starting conversations about worker wellness and mental health. Meanwhile, the media storm surrounding the incident had begun to quiet down, as all viral stories do. But for Ms. Jackson, the impact of her message was just beginning. She had opened a door to a much larger discussion, one that wasn't going to end simply because the headlines had shifted to the next big story. People were still talking about it, still reflecting on how they treated others, and still thinking about what kind of society they wanted to create. Her speech had sparked a movement, and the conversations were continuing offline, in classrooms, workplaces, and homes across the country. As Ms. Jackson settled into her new routine, she continued to receive messages from people who had been inspired by her courage. She started to get invites to speak at more events, some related to education, others to workplace wellness and mental health. She was no longer just a teacher attending a conference. She had become a voice for those who were often overlooked, a spokeswoman for respect, equality, and the importance of self-care in high-pressure jobs. But despite all the recognition, despite the accolades and the speaking engagements, Ms. Jackson remained focused on the original message, that respect and dignity should be afforded to everyone, no matter their job, their background, or their station in life. She hadn't expected to be in the spotlight. She hadn't asked for any of this. But now that she was there, she realized that her experience had given her an opportunity to create real change, and that in the end was more important than any viral moment. This was about creating a culture of empathy, understanding, and respect, a culture where no one was treated as less than. As she looked back on everything that had transpired, from the slap on the plane to the speeches and conversations that followed, she knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But it was a road worth walking, and she was determined to keep going one step at a time. Several months had passed since Ms. Jackson's keynote speech at the conference, and the ripple effects of her experience were continuing to spread. What had started as a deeply personal and unexpected moment of conflict had turned into a full-fledged campaign for respect, empathy, and accountability in both customer service and broader society. Her message had reached far beyond the confines of the plane where the incident took place. It had sparked a movement, one that resonated with individuals from all walks of life. But despite the national attention, Ms. Jackson remained focused on the bigger picture, the ongoing need for systemic change in how we treat those in service jobs and how we support people in high-stress, low-wage positions. As she moved forward, Ms. Jackson became increasingly involved in various initiatives that aimed to tackle burnout in service industries. She started collaborating with worker advocacy groups and mental health organizations, speaking about the need for better mental health resources for employees who were often invisible in society's eyes. She met with airline representatives, not only to discuss what had happened on her flight, but also to explore ways the airline industry could offer better training and support for their staff, emphasizing emotional intelligence, de-escalation techniques, and self-care strategies. One of the most fulfilling moments for her came when she was invited to join a national panel on workplace wellness. It was a moment she had never envisioned when she boarded that flight months ago. She had always been passionate about education and teaching, but now she was advocating for something bigger, creating workplaces where employees weren't just seen as a means to an end, but as human beings with real needs, challenges, and value. During the panel, she shared the story of her own experience, but this time, it wasn't just about her. It was about the lessons she had learned from the situation, the conversations she had had with people in similar positions, and the calls to action she had received from individuals across the country. She spoke about the importance of holding employers accountable for the mental and emotional well-being of their staff, especially in high-stress environments. She talked about how small acts of kindness could go a long way in preventing situations like the one she had experienced. She stressed the importance of empathy, not just for passengers, but for the people who were serving them. Ms. Jackson's words resonated deeply with the audience. The room was full of workers from various industries, many of whom had struggled with similar issues of burnout, stress, and lack of recognition. After the panel, she was approached by several people who thanked her for speaking out. A flight attendant who had been in the industry for 20 years told her, "You have no idea how much what you said means to me. It's like no one sees the pressure we're under. No one ever talks about it." It was those conversations, those quiet moments of connection, that made everything feel worth it to Ms. Jackson. She wasn't just creating a wave of awareness for the public eye. She was connecting with the very people who had been silently bearing the weight of their jobs for years, without recognition, without support, and often without the basic respect they deserved. But even as she found fulfillment in her new work, Ms. Jackson knew that the path ahead wasn't always going to be smooth. There were still detractors, still people who viewed her story as an overreaction, or a public spectacle, as some had called it. Online comments still flooded in, some with praise, others with criticism. The media, too, had moved on to the next viral story, and in some ways the attention had faded. But in her heart, Ms. Jackson knew the conversation hadn't ended. It had only just begun. It was easy for the headlines to change, for the public's focus to shift. But she wasn't interested in chasing the fleeting spotlight. She was in this for the long haul. Every email she received, every conversation she had, every speech she gave was a reminder that this movement was far from over. She was committed to pushing forward, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless, who had ever been dismissed or mistreated. She had found her purpose in a way she had never expected, and now she couldn't walk away from it. One afternoon, as she sat at her desk, reviewing her notes for an upcoming interview, she received a letter. It was from the flight attendant involved in the incident. Ms. Jackson had never expected to hear from her again, let alone receive an apology. The letter was simple but powerful. "I've thought a lot about what happened that day," it began. "I've gone through training since then, and I've realized the mistake I made. What I did was inexcusable, and I'm truly sorry for what you went through. I know I can't undo the hurt, but I want you to know that I've taken responsibility for my actions and have made efforts to learn from this. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to reflect on what I did wrong. I hope you find peace in knowing that." Ms. Jackson read the letter several times. It wasn't an easy apology to accept, but it was sincere. She had always believed that people were capable of growth, of change, and here, in this letter, was the evidence that her story had sparked something within the flight attendant herself. She wrote back a simple response. "Thank you for your words. I believe that we all have the ability to change and grow, and I appreciate your reflection on what happened. I hope that your growth can be an example for others, just as this whole experience has been for me." As she closed the letter, Ms. Jackson couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. What started as a painful and humiliating experience on a flight had transformed into something much greater. It had sparked a larger conversation about respect, about human dignity, and about the way we treat others in every corner of society. It had connected her to people in ways she never imagined, and had given her a platform to create real, lasting change. She realized, in that moment, that while the journey had been unexpected, it had led her to a place of purpose and fulfillment. The world had changed a little bit, and she had played a part in that. But perhaps the most important thing she had learned was this: change wasn't about one big moment or one viral story. It was about the ongoing, everyday conversations we have with one another, the empathy we show, and the ways we choose to treat those who serve us. It was about being a voice for those who feel unseen, and in the end, that was a fight worth fighting. She smiled, thinking about what came next. The road ahead was long, but she was ready to keep walking it, because she knew, without a doubt, that the story wasn't over yet. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Thanks for watching.